part of London where immigrants have settled. Dark-skinned people from India and Pakistan, from the islands of the Caribbean, blown here by economic winds that few of them understood. They only knew that their homelands were poor and overcrowded, and that across the seas was Britain, their former ruler, who beckoned for their labor. And they came to settle cheek by jowl with poor English and poor Irish in the old decaying parts of our big cities. The people they settled among often resent their being here. They see them as intruders, interlopers, who threaten their jobs, their houses, and their schools. It's difficult to see why our economy needed more and more poorly paid foreign labor when it couldn't house and school them properly. But it did. We are using these people for our own needs, just as we have in the past. The history of our relations with the people of our former colonies is not, by and large, a happy one. Although we sent out doctors and administrators, we fashioned these foreign lands to our own needs, to provide us with raw materials, sugar, spices, rubber, oils, and cotton. The worst thing of all is what happened in Africa. 400 years ago, we made them slaves. Before the slavers began their evil business, travelers from Europe saw little difference between the way of life in Africa and that at home. In many parts of Africa, the people lived in cities, wove cloth and carved wood into beautiful effigies that are an inspiration to this day. They traded vast distances, perhaps even as far as China. But the slave trade ended most of that. It decimated Africa. The Arabs from the east and the Europeans from the west. Their whole way of life was torn apart, towns pillaged, families split, and 10 million carted off to the Americas and the Caribbean. 8 out of 10 of them died before they reached their destination. To die on the way was perhaps the best end a man could hope for. For aboard the ship, the slaves were packed like rows of books on a shelf, chained 2 by 2, right leg and left leg, right hand and left hand. Each slave had less room than a man in a coffin. The slave trade was the result of the economic boom that was taking place in the Caribbean and the Americas, the great development of the sugar and cotton plantations. Forced labor captured from the other side of the Atlantic became an absolute necessity. And it was so much easier to treat your workers as cheap, expendable goods who could be bought and sold like animals, irrespective of whether they had children, or wives, or husbands. It was so much easier to beat them and punish them in order to make them work harder than to pay them and feed them and house them properly. The slave trade played a crucial role in financing the Industrial Revolution. The slave ships would sail from England with a cargo of manufactured goods. They were then exchanged at a profit for Africans, who in turn were sold to the plantations at another profit, in exchange for sugar or cotton to be brought back to England. The annual income to Britain from the West Indian plantations was reckoned by Prime Minister William Pitt to be £4 million, as compared with £1 million from the rest of the world. By the end of the 18th century, Liverpool had well over half of the British slave trade. The profits from the slave trade were fantastically high. On a fortunate voyage, the ship owner could make as much as £50,000. The capital accumulated by Liverpool poured into the hinterland to fertilize the energies of Manchester, the home of the Industrial Revolution. James Watt, the originator of the first practical steam engine, the invention that more than anything else made the Industrial Revolution possible, owed his invention to money loaned to him by a Liverpool bank, that in turn raised its capital largely from profits made in the West Indian trade. The slave trade helped make England strong, and a strong England could impose its will around the world. It was in India that British imperialism reached the height of its power. The Mughal Empire, once the upholder of all that was cultivated and ordered in India, had begun to fall apart. Into this vacuum, British merchants moved, and on their coattails came the British Empire. Competition between British and French merchants rapidly became competition between rival empires. Each country backed feuding Indian princes. It wasn't until the 1760s that Clive of India was able to impose his will on behalf of the British realm. England by then could truly rule the waves. Her wealth and naval power were unsurpassed. And within India, it was British interests that were to rule supreme for almost 2 centuries. Before the British took over, India was known around the world for the beauty of her craftwork and her fine fabrics. But now, some of India's principal exports were totally prohibited in Britain. And even within India itself, the sale of Indian fabrics was controlled. And in their place came textiles and manufactures from the slums of Lancashire, not the careful products of skilled craftsmen, but the output of large machines tended by the dirt-cheap labor of women and small children. The poor of Britain were set against the poor of India. Britain did bring certain benefits to India. She built railways, improved the waterways, introduced technical innovations. Above all, she introduced modern medicine. But sadly, her medical efforts were more successful than all the others put together. India's population grew by leaps and bounds, but her food production couldn't keep pace. And over the 200 years of British rule, the evidence appears to indicate that the standard of living in India declined. Today, India, Pakistan, and the West Indies are fighting a war on poverty. There's a raging battle to keep food production ahead of population. Although they're trying to introduce industry, it's difficult for them to find markets for their goods abroad, because the rich countries have erected high tax walls against them. Also, in recent years, the prices of many of their traditional exports have been falling, while the prices of the things they buy from us, like fertilizer and tractors, have been going up. We shouldn't be surprised then if some of them have migrated here to look for work. Even so, it's only a tiny percentage that have come. Black people have lived in England for a long time. In the 17th and 18th centuries, black servants were very fashionable, and the death register in this old church records the burial of a Negro seaman in 1730. In 1770, it was estimated that London had a black population of 14,000. But the number of coloured people who've come to Britain is far exceeded by the number of British who've emigrated, often displacing, sometimes exterminating, the native peoples. They went to the Americas, Africa, and Australia. Today is not the first time that large waves of immigrants have come into Britain. In the 16th century, there were the Huguenots fleeing persecution in France. In the 19th century, the Great Famine drove hordes of Irish peasants here, who were regarded as merely dirty and feckless, undesirable semi-aliens. The arrival of the East European Jews at the end of the last century was the most significant wave of immigration in recent history. They were fleeing persecution in Russia and Poland. When they arrived, there was a great public outcry against them. It was said they turned East London into a slum, full of overcrowding, disease, and prostitution.
During my school days, with the children in the school, we used to play quite nicely, and if I happened to get the better of them in some way or other, they would turn nasty and say, let's set on her, she's only a Jew girl.
But of course, naturally, we always had that word of go back to Russia, even though we were born here.
As they are now Paki bashing, so it was Jewish bashing then. But,
a royal commission in 1908, although finding little evidence to support the common prejudice against Jews, recommended that fewer foreigners be allowed to enter Britain. Although it's poverty and lack of opportunity that makes today's immigrants want to leave their homeland, it's only possible for them to do so because we need their skills. They are not uninvited guests. In the 1950s in particular, Britain was short of certain skills. Doctors and nurses on the one hand, bus drivers and textile workers on the other. In Lancashire, poor Pakistani immigrants working on night shift are helping to keep going a textile industry which is in direct competition with the same industry in Pakistan. The sad fact is that the factories in Pakistan can't employ them all, because they can't sell enough abroad. So the Pakistanis come here, where their labor is needed, and where at least they can get enough to eat and save up something for their kinsmen in their villages back home. But by helping to strengthen our textile industry, they make it even more unlikely that Pakistan's own industry will find the markets it needs. Yet despite the fact that we have used these people for centuries, and today are using them again for our own purposes, we don't like them being here.
Those whom the gods wish to destroy, they first make mad. We must be mad. Literally mad as a nation to be permitting the annual inflow of some 50,000 dependents who are, for the most part, the material of the future growth of the immigrant-descended population. It is like watching a nation busily engaged in heaping up its own funeral pyre.
When you say they take our jobs...
Back in Islington, in the corner pub, are some of the people who honestly feel threatened by these immigrants.
About immigration and all them coming over, isn't it?
Years ago, we got on without them. Before they come over here, in hospitals, buses and all that, it was still run, wasn't it, without them.
Why do you employ so many coloured workers?
Well, we find there's a shortage of labour in North London, and most of the people who come up for interviews are coloured. And we're quite prepared to accept them, train them on milling machines, drilling, turning, grinding, get them up to our standard to do the work, and after about 6 months, they're quite good on the machine.
Well, just sort of your labour exchange, you just check on them how many's unemployed.
I can tell you that in the London area, out of every 100 people unemployed, we know that about 7 have come from either the West Indies, Africa or Asia. If we look at the unemployment figures for the country as a whole, we find that the proportion of immigrants unemployed who have come from the new Commonwealth is no higher than the proportion of the unemployed from the population as a whole.
Are there many coloured people living here?
Where are they? Just say to me how many white people are there. And
does this bother you?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, it does bother me because I've got a young daughter. I mean, mine, she's only 2.5, but I mean, at times when my wife comes home from work, I have to go and meet her from work because she's terrified to walk from Holloway Road down to where I live.
Why is that?
People they grab you and attack you, don't they? I've had it done to my mother-in-law.
This has nothing to do with coloured people.
It is. My mother-in-law was attacked by a coloured person outside my gate. Yeah? I mean, so just keep them all away from this country, and just stop them from coming in.
I mean, you're trying to suggest that coloured people are more prone to crime than English people.
Well, I wouldn't say that, but I mean, they sort of... How many times do you hear of a white person attacking a white woman? I mean, like a coloured person. I mean, they're sort of... I mean, they're just mad, aren't they?
Well, our experience has shown that immigrants are as law-abiding as the rest of the community and commit no more crimes percentage-wise than the rest of the population.
The headmistress of the local primary school knows Islington well.
It is difficult for anyone to believe that in 1937 these houses were all condemned as being unfit for human habitation. Yet today there are many families who live in overcrowded conditions, often with 5 or 6 children in a family, and paying exorbitant rents of between £5 and £6 a week. Often there is no hot running water in these flats and no indoor lavatories. Immigrants have particular problems in an area such as this of prejudice and discrimination. But the main problems affect everyone. English, Irish, Pakistanis, Cypriots, Indians. And they are problems of housing, low wages, and a lack of play space. For example, there is nowhere around here where boys may play football comfortably. They're often playing football in the streets. The fact is, immigrants have only highlighted these difficulties and these problems which have existed for many years.
It seems that it's the less well-off people, whatever their colour, who have to bear the brunt of the failings of our society. Yesterday it was the English mill workers of the Industrial Revolution, the slaves of the Caribbean, and the peasants of India. Today it's the people who live in a place like this.
Unless we all stick together, we're not going to get anywhere. It's no good whites sticking on their own and colour sticking on their own, because
Lil Houghton, she's lived in this part of Islington all her life.
And what colour, what nationality, what you are and what you're not. The council's taken a roof from over our head and we've all got to have one put back. So whether you're black, white, Greek, Turk, Italian, doesn't matter what you are, you've all got to stick together, and that's the only way we're going to win it. And it is serious. We have got a group up and we take up their cases for them and help fight them with them. And while we're all sticking together, we are on the winning end of it.
Islington may seem a long way from slavery and imperialism, Liverpool and the Industrial Revolution. But they're all signposts on the same road. And there's no end in sight.
Yeah, well, I in the last couple of years, I've begun to realise, and think about it more. And you realise the difference, that they're all normal people, they're the same. You find the same thing amongst whites as you do get amongst blacks,
They're all equal, yeah? Nobody's bigger than the other one.
I don't mind being called in black, but when it comes to the bastard bit, I'll kill them.
And do you think the white kids do pick on the black kids?
Not to a fair amount.
Why do you think that is?
Because the whites think they're taking over the country.
Do you think they are?
Yeah.
Okay.